May 12, 1944, the Führerbunker, Berlin. Adolf Hitler stood beneath 16 feet of reinforced concrete as the ground trembled with distant impacts. For 3 years, he had promised the German people that enemy bombers would never reach the Reich capital in daylight. Now, through the narrow observation slit, he could see contrails streaking across the afternoon sky, hundreds of them, forming geometric patterns that stretched from horizon to horizon. The air raid sirens had been wailing for 90 minutes. His adjutants reported the numbers. Over 1,500 American heavy bombers, escorted by nearly 900 long-range fighters, striking synthetic oil plants at Zeitz and Brucks, aircraft factories at Oschersleben, and targets throughout Berlin itself. But it was not the size of the raid that made Hitler fall silent. It was the altitude. The American formations flew at 25,000 feet, untouchable, methodical, as if conducting a training exercise over empty farmland rather than the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Where his Luftwaffe fighter wings should have been tearing into those bomber streams, there was only scattered, ineffective resistance. The mathematics were undeniable. American fighters now possessed both the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and the performance to dominate any engagement. The war in Europe's outcome was no longer in question. What Hitler witnessed that afternoon was not just another bombing raid, but the final proof that American industrial capacity and technological innovation had broken the back of German air power, transforming the Reich's skies from fortress to shooting gallery in less than 18 months. October 14, 1943. High Wycombe, England. Inside the underground operations room of the 8th Air Force headquarters, General Ira Eaker stood before a wall map covered in red pins, each marking a bomber formation that had failed to return. The previous day's mission to the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt had cost him 60 B-17 flying fortresses and 600 trained crewmen. The week before, Regensburg had taken 36 more. The numbers told a story that no amount of courage could overcome. Without fighter escort deep into Germany, American strategic bombing was bleeding to death over the Reich. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the 8th Air Force's primary escort fighter, carried enough fuel to reach 450 miles from its English bases before turning back. Beyond that radius, the bomber streams flew alone into German airspace, where Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s waited in formation, attacking methodically, targeting engines and cockpits with practiced precision. Mission planners had tried everything: varied altitudes, evasive routing, concentrated defensive fire from the bombers themselves. Nothing worked. The Luftwaffe owned the skies beyond the P-47's fuel range, and Germany's most vital industrial targets sat well inside that protected zone. North American Aviation proposed a solution that spring. The P-51B Mustang, originally designed as a ground attack aircraft for the RAF, had been transformed by mating its American airframe to the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The combination produced a fighter with unprecedented range when equipped with external drop tanks. Initial projections suggested 850 miles of operational radius, enough to reach Berlin and return. By September 1943, the first P-51Bs began arriving in England, and commanders allowed themselves cautious optimism. But the early combat reports revealed a troubling gap. The Mustang could reach the targets, but once there, German fighters still held the performance advantage at high altitude. Above 25,000 feet, where the bomber formations flew, the Bf-109G could outclimb the P-51B in vertical maneuvers. The FW-190 could outdive it in disengagement. American pilots found themselves escorting bombers deep into Germany only to watch German interceptors attack with near impunity, knowing the Mustangs lacked the power margin to dominate the engagement. Range had been solved, but the tactical equation remained balanced in Germany's favor. That autumn, a different kind of solution emerged not from aircraft designers, but from fuel chemists working in laboratories across America and Britain. Engineers studying engine performance data noticed something unexpected. The Merlin engine supercharger system could theoretically operate at higher manifold pressures than currently authorized, but doing so required fuel that could withstand greater compression without detonating prematurely. The existing 100-octane aviation gasoline represented the limit of what current chemistry could deliver reliably. What the war needed was fuel that didn't yet exist in production quantities, a chemical formulation so advanced it would rewrite the performance ceiling of every Allied fighter in the sky. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, January 1944. Test pilot Major Thomas Hayes settled into the cockpit of a P-51B Mustang as ground crew topped off the fuel tanks with a liquid that gleamed purple in the winter sunlight. The dye marked it as experimental, grade 100, 150 octane aviation gasoline, a fuel formulation so volatile that unauthorized use could destroy an engine in minutes. Hayes had been briefed on the numbers. Standard 100-octane fuel allowed the Merlin engine to operate at 61 inches of manifold pressure for short combat bursts. This new mixture was cleared for 75 inches, pressures that would have been considered catastrophic just months earlier. The science behind the purple fuel represented a chemical revolution. Octane rating measured a fuel's resistance to pre-ignition under compression. Standard gasoline molecules, when squeezed by a supercharger and heated by combustion chamber temperatures, would detonate spontaneously before the spark plug fired, destroying pistons and cylinder heads within seconds. British and American chemists had solved this by dramatically increasing the aromatic hydrocarbon content, primarily toluene and xylene, while adding tetraethyl lead in concentrations that pushed toxicity boundaries. The result was a fuel that could withstand compression ratios previously thought impossible, allowing superchargers to force more air into the cylinders, generating more power from the same displacement. Hayes advanced the throttle past war emergency power, watching the manifold pressure gauge climb into the purple arc. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang accelerated through 440 miles per hour, then 450. The airspeed indicator touched 448 mm in level flight, a performance envelope that exceeded every German fighter in operational service. More critically, the aircraft could sustain this power output for extended periods without the thermal stress that plagued earlier fuel formulations. Ground engineers monitoring the test-recorded data that would reshape air combat doctrine. The performance gain wasn't incremental, it was transformational. What made the achievement even more remarkable was its invisibility. German intelligence tracked Allied aircraft production, monitored design modifications, intercepted radio communications about tactics and formations. But fuel chemistry left no visual signature. A Mustang burning 150 octane looked identical to one using standard 100 octane. The Luftwaffe would discover the difference only when their pilots reported that American fighters suddenly possessed climb rates and sustained speeds that defied previous encounter data. By then, the tactical advantage would already be cementing Allied air superiority, yet triumph in the laboratory meant nothing without industrial-scale production. The United States needed to manufacture this complex fuel in quantities measured not in thousands, but millions of gallons monthly, then transported across the Atlantic where German U-boats still prowled shipping lanes. Refineries from Texas to California retooled their catalytic cracking units and alkylation plants. The chemical plants at Baton Rouge, Port Arthur, and Los Angeles began producing aromatic compounds at rates that strained the nation's industrial capacity. By March 1944, the first tankers carrying purple-dyed aviation gasoline departed American ports for England, each shipment representing not just fuel, but a chemical advantage the Third Reich's synthetic fuel program, starved of crude oil and dependent on coal liquefaction, could never replicate. The question now was whether enough could reach England in time to matter. March 6, 1944, Debden Airfield, England. Captain Don Gentile performed his pre-flight walk-around in darkness, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Behind him, 668 P-51 Mustangs sat on hardstands across East Anglia, their Merlin engines soon to power the deepest penetration mission yet attempted. The target was Berlin, 600 miles into the Third Reich. For 3 years, the German capital had remained beyond American fighter escort range, protected by distance as much as by flak and interceptors. Today, that sanctuary ended. Ground crews had filled each Mustang's internal tanks with purple-tinted fuel and hung twin 85-gallon drop tanks beneath the wings. The mathematics finally worked. The bomber stream assembled over the English Channel at dawn, 730 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators forming combat boxes that stretched across miles of sky. The Mustangs took position around them, stepped at different altitudes, weaving in fluid formations that conserved fuel while maintaining coverage. As the Armada crossed into German airspace, Luftwaffe controllers vectored interceptor groups toward the formation. German fighter pilots, veterans of 2 years defending the Reich, climbed to engagement altitude expecting the familiar tactical scenario. American escorts would be forced to turn back somewhere over central Germany, leaving the bombers vulnerable for the final approach. But the Mustangs didn't turn back. Near Magdeburg, 150 miles from Berlin, Luftwaffe FW-190s and Bf-109s dove into the bomber stream. American pilots met them at 26,000 feet, and the German pilots immediately recognized something had changed. The Mustangs accelerated in pursuit with authority that defied previous encounters. When FW-190s attempted their standard tactic of diving away to disengage, P-51s followed, maintaining closure through the descent. When Bf-109Gs tried climbing vertically to exploit their traditional advantage, Mustangs matched them, sustaining power output that kept the German fighters within gun range. Mission reports filed that evening documented sustained speeds of 445 mph at altitude, climb rates exceeding 3,500 feet per minute, and combat endurance that allowed pilots to engage, pursue, and re-engage without fuel concerns. Over Berlin itself, American fighters established air superiority for the first time in the war. The psychological impact transcended tactical metrics. For the German capital's defenders and citizens below, the sight of American fighters circling freely above the city at midday shattered 3 years of propaganda promises. For Allied bomber crews, the presence of friendly fighters over the target represented a transformation in survival odds that would define the remainder of the air campaign. Luftwaffe command posts received pilot reports throughout the afternoon, describing American fighter performance that seemed impossible based on previous intelligence. FW-190 pilots reported being overtaken in dives. Bf-109 units documented sustained high-altitude combat where Mustangs maintained power advantages. German technical intelligence officers struggled to explain the discrepancy. The P-51's airframe hadn't changed. Its engine remained the Packard-built Merlin. Yet somehow American fighters had gained a performance margin that negated Germany's interceptor advantages. Within days, Luftwaffe High Command reached an unavoidable conclusion. If American fighters could now escort bombers anywhere in Germany with tactical superiority, then every strategic target in the Reich had become vulnerable, including the synthetic fuel plants that provided 90% of German aviation gasoline. The air defense mission was about to become impossible. May 12, 1944, Luna, Germany. At 11:47 hours, formation bombardiers over the Luna synthetic fuel works released their payloads from 23,000 feet. The massive hydrogenation plant, stretching across 10 square kilometers of industrial landscape near Mersburg, vanished beneath cascading explosions. Simultaneously, 350 miles north, American bombers struck the Politz synthetic oil complex near Stettin. Throughout central Germany, B-17s and B-24s attacked targets at Brux, Zeitz, and Oschersleben. The raids were not exploratory. They represented the beginning of systematic industrial dismantlement, the first day of what planners called the oil plan. Germany possessed no natural petroleum reserves. The Reich's entire war machine ran on synthetic fuel produced from coal through 2 chemical processes: Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, which yielded diesel and lubricants, and the Burgius hydrogenation method, which produced aviation gasoline. 18 major plants, each requiring years to construct and consuming steel, equivalent to building multiple battleships, converted coal into liquid fuel using catalysts, extreme pressures, and temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius. In April 1944, these facilities produced 175,000 tons of aviation gasoline monthly, 92% of the Luftwaffe's total supply. The entire infrastructure depended on complex, fragile equipment that could not be quickly replaced or easily dispersed. The May 12th raids achieved immediate results. Luna's production dropped by 80%. Politz ceased operations entirely for 3 weeks. By June, when Allied bombers had struck every major synthetic fuel plant at least once, German aviation gasoline production had collapsed to 52,000 tons monthly, less than 1/3 of April's output. The Luftwaffe's fuel allocation reports documented the cascading crisis. Pilot training programs, already truncated, received further cuts. Operational squadrons found themselves rationed to defensive missions only. Fighter units that had once flown multiple sorties daily now preserved fuel for single large-scale interceptions. By September 1944, monthly aviation gasoline production had fallen to 10,000 tons. Reserve stockpiles accumulated before the oil plan began were exhausted. Training schools closed entirely, their instructors reassigned to combat units despite having no recent operational experience. The Luftwaffe possessed thousands of newly manufactured aircraft sitting immobile on airfields equipped with armament and ammunition, but lacking the fuel to reach combat altitude. German commanders faced arithmetic that permitted no solution. Defending the synthetic fuel plants required flying fighters, but flying fighters consumed the fuel those plants produced. Every gallon burned in defense meant one less gallon available for future operations. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, wrote in his diary that the attacks had struck Germany at its weakest point. He was correct. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated through pilot losses or aircraft attrition alone. It had been strangled by industrial mathematics, choked by the systematic destruction of infrastructure that could not be defended and could not be rebuilt fast enough to matter. The purple fuel that powered American escorts to Berlin had enabled the bombers that now dismantled the Reich's ability to produce any fuel at all. May 23, 1944, the Berghof, Obersalzberg, Hermann Göring stood before Adolf Hitler in the Great Hall with its panoramic view of the Bavarian Alps, a geography that offered no escape from the question that dominated the meeting. 11 days had passed since American bombers had struck Berlin with impunity. Hitler's voice, alternating between cold inquiry and volcanic rage, demanded explanation. How had the Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, been reduced to ineffectual spectator over the Reich capital? Göring, Reich Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, offered technical justifications about escort fighter range and fuel shortages. But Hitler cut through each excuse with the instinct of a man confronting betrayal rather than military setback. The numbers, when finally laid bare, told a story no rhetoric could disguise. American aircraft production in 1944 would reach 96,000 units. German production, despite Herculean efforts under Albert Speer's rationalization programs, would peak at 40,000. But raw production figures only began the accounting. The Luftwaffe had lost 2,162 pilots killed in action during the first 4 months of 1944 alone, irreplaceable men with combat experience now buried or captured. Their replacements arrived at operational squadrons with 50 flight hours of training compared to the 400 hours American pilots received. The fuel crisis compounded every deficit. Where American fighters burned 150 octane gasoline that allowed sustained combat power, German synthetic fuel provided barely adequate performance while supplies dwindled toward catastrophic shortage. Hitler authorized desperate countermeasures. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, previously delayed by Hitler's own insistence it be modified as a bomber, received priority for deployment as an interceptor. Plans advanced for Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields planned for January 1945. Yet even as Hitler issued these orders, the undertone had shifted. He spoke less of victory conditions and more of revenge weapons, the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets that would punish British cities, but could not restore air superiority or defend German industry. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels recorded observations in his diary that would have been unthinkable propaganda just months earlier. On March 2, 1945, following another daylight raid, he wrote with stark clarity that the enemy air fleet ruled German skies at will, that no illusion remained about the future. The contrails that Hitler had witnessed on May 12th had become daily phenomena. White lines scratched across blue sky above the capital, physical proof that Allied air power operated beyond German interdiction. For the propaganda minister whose career had been built on manufacturing belief through repetition, the visual evidence overhead defeated rhetoric. The psychological collapse among Nazi leadership was proceeding independently of their public proclamations. Hitler's rhetoric increasingly abandoned practical military discussion in favor of vengeance fantasies and miracle weapon speculation. The Führer, who had once micromanaged tactical decisions, now spoke in abstract terms about historical destiny and final victory through willpower. The air war had been lost, a reality privately acknowledged but publicly denied. What remained was the performance of confidence before subordinates, allies, and the German people. A charade maintained even as American bombers continued their methodical dismantling of the Reich's industrial capacity, unopposed by a Luftwaffe that possessed aircraft without fuel and pilots without training to fly them. September 1944. Uschersleben, Germany. A newly manufactured Focke-Wulf FW-190D fighter sat on the tarmac alongside dozens of identical aircraft, their engines preserved in protective cocoons, their fuel tanks empty. The factory workers who had assembled them under Albert Speer's emergency production programs had fulfilled quotas that defied the Allied bombing campaign. German aircraft production in 1944 would reach 39,807 units, a number that would have represented triumph in any previous year of the war. But the aircraft sat immobile, monuments to industrial achievement rendered meaningless by a different shortage. The Luftwaffe possessed no fuel to fly them and no adequately trained pilots to occupy their cockpits. The statistics of the air war's final phase told a story of systematic collapse. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 2,262 single-engine fighter pilots killed in action, a figure representing nearly 100% of the entire day fighter force present on December 31, 1943. In May alone, German fighter losses reached 50.4% of available aircraft, with 25% pilot casualties. American bomber losses, which had peaked at 409 four-engine aircraft lost in April, began declining sharply even as sortie rates increased. By late May 1944, 8th Air Force bomber formations often completed entire missions without encountering German fighters. The Luftwaffe could oppose only portions of attacking formations, while remainder flew unmolested to their targets. The transformation had required 18 months from inception to completion. In October 1943, American planners had confronted catastrophic loss rates and no technical solution. By May 1944, the combination of long-range P-51 escorts, burning purple-dyed 100 or 150-octane fuel, and systematic destruction of German synthetic fuel production had achieved air supremacy so complete that remaining Luftwaffe resistance represented statistical anomaly rather than strategic factor. The fuel crisis alone had reduced German aviation gasoline production from 175,000 tons monthly in April 1944 to 10,000 tons by September, forcing the grounding of operational squadrons and complete cessation of pilot training programs. The irony was profound. Adolf Hitler had promised the German people an impregnable Reich defended by the world's most advanced air force. That promise was undone not through superior courage in combat or brilliant tactical innovation, but through chemistry, industrial logistics, and resource access. The purple fuel that allowed Merlin engines to operate at 75 inches of manifold pressure, the refineries in Texas and California that produced millions of gallons monthly, the supply chains that transported it across the Atlantic, and the targeting planners who systematically dismantled German synthetic fuel infrastructure represented warfare conducted at industrial and scientific scales that transcended individual heroism. The contrails Hitler had witnessed over Berlin on May 12, 1944 marked the moment when air power's strategic potential was fully realized. American bombers ranged across Germany, selecting targets based on strategic priority rather than defensive limitations. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, could not defend its own airspace. By January 1945, thousands of German fighters sat unused on airfields, while Allied aircraft operated with impunity overhead. The air war had been decided not in dogfights but in fuel laboratories and industrial production facilities, won by nations whose access to petroleum, chemical expertise, and manufacturing capacity made victory inevitable once those advantages were systematically applied. The sky fortress that Nazi propaganda had proclaimed unbreakable had been broken by superior science, and the lesson would reshape military doctrine for generations.